In this video, we are looking at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, otherwise known as the Reconstruction Amendments, passed in the years following the Civil War. First, let's take a look at the context. During the Civil War, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the Confederacy. However, this did not apply to the slaves in the border states that had stayed in the Union. The proclamation did, however, get the wheels turning on a push for an amendment that would completely ban slavery. While the war was winding down and coming to an end in April of 1865, the 13th Amendment was well on its way to being ratified, and would be so by year's end. However, the plans of Reconstruction were initially thrown into turmoil as Lincoln had been assassinated, and his replacement, Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, did not have the same vision and aims for the former slaves and the South in general as the radical Republicans who controlled Congress. After a few contentious years between President Johnson and Congress, eventually the radical Republicans would wrestle control over Reconstruction and were able to implement and pass their policies. The radical Republicans wanted to settle the legal questions around the former slaves and guarantee them full citizenship rights. First, let's take a look at the 13th Amendment, which is the most straightforward of them. It completely abolishes slavery in all of the United States. No more exceptions for border slave states that stayed in the Union. Slavery is completely and finally done. Well, almost. There is an exception that will be exploited by many state prison systems. If a person is convicted and sent to jail or prison for a crime, they can be forced to work for little or no pay. I highly recommend the documentary The 13th, which shows how badly this part of the amendment has been exploited. Moving on to the 14th Amendment, there are 4 sections to this amendment, but I am only going to focus on the information most pertinent to APUSH. The 14th Amendment states that persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. The reason and meaning for this in the time period was to ensure former slaves are now citizens. It also has incredibly important clauses about due process applying to everyone. So all the legal rights in the Constitution, for example, speedy and public trials and the right to a lawyer, to name just a few, applies to everyone. Everyone is also supposed to be equally protected by the law, and the law is supposed to be applied equally to everyone. In practice, this is not always the case. However, this equal protection clause will have an important legacy that we will get to at the end of the video. The last Reconstruction Amendment is the 15th, which says the right to vote cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Key note here, the 15th Amendment does not say anything about the right to vote based on someone's sex. I will come back to this as well later. The intentions of the amendments and the radical Republicans are quite clear. They are to make clear the status of former slaves and to give and guarantee rights to former slaves. Moving on to who would agree and disagree with the amendments. African Americans and radical Republicans cheered the amendments, while women's suffrage advocates were dismayed that the 15th Amendment only applied to men. Many women's suffrage advocates had also been vocal abolitionists and had seen the fight for both as one and the same. Now they felt left behind. Many white Southerners did not like the amendments, and when Reconstruction ended, they passed state laws that subverted the intentions of the amendments. This will usher in the era of segregation, also known as Jim Crow. Important to note that this was not just a Southern phenomenon, as laws restricted rights will be passed in areas all across the country. Finally, the legacy of the Reconstruction Amendments. The amendments themselves were great achievements. However, regressive state laws will weaken the effectiveness of the amendments. The Supreme Court will fail to strengthen the amendments, as it will back the discriminatory state laws. This can be seen as early on as the slaughterhouse cases in 1873 and Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Not until the 1950s will the federal government really begin to enforce the rights in the Reconstruction Amendments. This can be seen in all branches of government. Some examples from the Supreme Court include Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which declared segregation inherently unequal and must end. Roe v. Wade in 1973, which ruled on women's reproductive rights based on the 14th Amendment concept of personal liberty. And the 2015 Oberfell versus Hodges case, which prohibited states from banning same-sex couples from marrying. The reason for this falls under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. In Congress, many pieces of legislation have been passed that support the amendments. But the two most notable are the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bans discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which got rid of many discriminatory actions like poll taxes and literacy tests by Southern states that limited the right to vote for African Americans. And finally, the executive branch took several notable actions, including President Truman's desegregating the military in 1947, Eisenhower federalizing the Arkansas National Guard and sending in troops to protect and allow African American high school students to attend a school that had been for whites only, and many of Johnson's Great Society programs had aims to help poor minorities. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please check out some other videos, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends.